For people unaware of the issues gender ideology presents in society, discovering these monumentally uncomfortable truths often elicits a feeling of shock and helplessness. They ask themselves, how can this be happening? Or they tell themselves, surely this can't be going on. There must be institutional safeguards against this kind of thing, right? But if they dare to dig deeper, they realize how intensely entrenched transgenderism has become throughout all of culture. Yet the lack of awareness is, at long last, much less of a problem in the United States due to the many legislative initiatives aimed at curtailing trans ideology, especially in the medical arena, that have been passed at the state level. These ongoing moves have generated considerable media coverage. Upon seeing minors and vulnerable young adults being put on a path of experimental drugs and undergoing surgeries to remove their physically healthy body parts, or when they see males invading women's sports, private spaces, and prisons, many react in horror, wondering, what can I do? Or how can we stop this? In the last 2 years, people who have become known by the term detransitioners have been testifying in public hearings and speaking to mostly conservative media about how their health was ruined and how their bodies were irreparably damaged by this experimental gender medicalization and surgery. As their heartbreaking stories become more widely known, and as the public continues to awaken to the enormous medical scandal that is so-called gender-affirming care, we've decided to launch Season 4 of the Generation Indoctrination podcast series to focus on what can be done to stem the tide of all the chaos. How are action-oriented people of all professional stripes combating this ideology? How are they helping detransitioners, their families, and everyone else who is affected? In this series, we will revisit some important history, speaking with people who foresaw the madness coming many years ago before these issues were on most people's radar. We'll also look into the future, exploring what's likely to come in light of the current reckoning Western societies are facing over gender ideology. For this inaugural episode, we will first travel to the Pacific Northwest, taking a look at Oregon, one of the most liberal states in the U.S., where trans ideology is deeply embedded in the government and in the broader culture. I spoke with Oregon State Representative Ed Deal, a Republican legislator who represents House District 17 and who has spearheaded efforts advocating for detransitioners. When a signature bill by the Democrat leadership was set to go through the legislature, Deal knew his options were limited, but he figured he had to at least try to somehow amend it.
I went down this rabbit hole on this issue to study it and understand it, and I connected with some great people. And one of them suggested, well, if they're going to do this, then let's do an amendment to make sure that it covers detransitioners too, because we can all agree that mistakes are going to be made. And so those folks, although you can't transition back, you can't really reverse these procedures, but at least give them the opportunity to the best of their ability to reverse. So I introduced what was called the Dash 14 Amendment, and it did three things. One, it made sure that detransitioners, it defined detransitioners, it made sure they were covered just as gender-affirming care was covered. Number two, it set up it was either a task force or a committee of people to research this issue and come up with a paper basically describing the pros and cons to make sure that people were informed before they went ahead with this. And the third thing was it increased the malpractice statute of limitations to, I think it was either 8 years or 10 years, just for quote unquote gender affirming care. So it did those three things. And the response I had was from the Democrat leadership was, oh, don't introduce this amendment. It's very controversial. I said, well, what's controversial about allowing someone who made this grave mistake to reverse what was done to them? What is controversial about that? But there's really an attitude that either there's no such thing as detransitioners or they've left the faith, I guess.
Advocacy for detransitioners is indeed hard, but despite narratives from legacy press, mainstream polling shows that even residents in liberal states do not support so-called gender-affirming care for minors. And yet the far left-wing political power is so entrenched that many elected Democrats in blue states do not appear to be listening to dissenters from within their ranks.
I don't know exactly what it is. I think the main reason is if you acknowledge it, their whole house of cards comes down because their claims get really weak if you acknowledge that some people did this. But I introduced that amendment, and I did introduce it, make a motion for it. There was the only discussion there was on that amendment was between me and the chair. No one else chimed in, but it went down on party lines. It was voted down almost on party lines. Yeah. I think we had one Republican who was too afraid to engage in the issue. In fact, I was told by the Republican leadership, don't issue this amendment. Don't do it. Then why? Well, then you're going to look like you support this bill. No, it's going to look like I support detransitioners is what it's going to look like. It's going to look like this bill is the mess that it is, and we're going to be ruining the lives of a lot of kids, and I want to give them a chance to recover. That's what it's going to look like. So I did it despite advice I was given.
When gender ideology influences public policy, decoding the language being used is crucial to understanding what's happening. And that language almost always relies upon sex stereotypes, semantics games, and circular rhetoric. Representative Deal explained that many of these ideological suppositions about human beings and medical care are already present in statutory definitions in existing Oregon law.
So the bill says it defines gender-affirming treatment, means a procedure, service, drug, device, or product that a physical or behavioral healthcare provider prescribes to treat an individual for incongruence between the individual's gender identity and the individual's sex assignment at birth. So that's what the bill says. And then what is gender identity? Well, then we look at the existing Oregon statute. And this is unbelievable that this is in Oregon law, but it is. Oregon statute says gender identity means an individual's gender-related identity. Do you like that? Appearance, expression, or behavior, regardless of whether the identity, appearance, expression, or behavior differs from that associated with the gender assigned to the individual at birth. Here's what they said. So gender-affirming treatment is if you're biologically a boy, you feel like a girl, that meets the definition, you can have this gender-affirming treatment. But let's say now that you look like a girl, but you realize you're a boy biologically. Well, now it's also gender-affirming treatment because your appearance is that of a girl. So it was like, what are you talking about? Then gender identity doesn't mean anything. It's just it's a nothing word, which is kind of what they want.
Indeed, the twisting of language is a feature, not a bug, of gender ideology. Given this, how can people respond when even every facet of the discussion is effectively rigged, or when it's baked into the state's legal structures, like it is in Oregon? What can be done? Lawmakers in neighboring Idaho are creating a notable framework as they attempt to reclaim the language and address one of the main roots of the issue. State Representative Julianne Young represents the 31st House District in Idaho, and earlier this year, Governor Brad Little signed the legislation that she spearheaded that defined sex on strictly biological grounds, so that an amorphous gender identity, known only to the person declaring that they possess one, will not be included in the law. When I interviewed her a few months ago, she explained that this isn't just an ultra-tedious linguistic exercise. The words we use in law have profound implications for everyone.
One of the thoughts that I had as I prepared for the hearing on this bill is that anyone who is supportive of having open, honest conversations ought to support these definitions in policy. I can't think of anything that makes it more difficult to put your arms around an issue and find a solution than a complete inability to communicate on both sides. And so having this language available to us and our ability to communicate openly and honestly in a way that everyone can understand is critical. And even for a person who is struggling with their own identity, it's one thing to say, I'm struggling with my maleness or with my femaleness. It's another thing to question your own biological existence. And what the left has done is so interesting because we started out with the idea that sex was somehow an objective term and gender was subjective, right? And now we've come to a place where people are telling us that gender identity, the way one identifies, is the concrete objective thing, and sex itself is just a sociological construct. Talk about complete confusion around an issue. That's challenging for someone who's already struggling emotionally. I don't know how they sort that out as individuals, let alone how we sort it out as a society.
Representative Young went on to explain how so much of the messaging around this is actually a manipulative reversal, and it requires a focus, sober-mindedness to realize it, and to respond to what's happening with the language and the repercussions it entails if left unchecked.
Another interesting twist on language that I've noticed as we've had these hearings is this discussion about erasing things. So over and over and over again, we've had testimony in opposition to this bill or the bill prohibiting the medicalization of children who struggle with their gender identity. The testimony really centers on this idea that we are erasing so-called trans people, when what's really happening is that that community is demanding the erasure of biological sex as a fact. They want it off the record. They want no record of its existence. You know, what's the end goal if it isn't erasure of biological sex and biological differences? But I think it actually goes beyond that in my mind. So I'm a mom, and my kids are probably the most important, significant thing in my entire life. As a mom, you give your life for your kids. You do anything for them. And I listen to this rhetoric, and what I hear is, between the lines, a person's role as a mother or as a father is insignificant. It's expendable. In fact, beyond expendable, it's desirable to erase it, to eliminate it. How tragic is that? Talk about erasing. And in this instance, you're not just erasing a fact, you're erasing the next generation. Because if you can convince a child to support self-sterilization, they will never have a child.
Legislators working to help detransitioners have to take different approaches depending on where one lives, as we've seen with Ed Deal in a blue state and Julianne Young in a red state. But what about those purple swing states? Greg Scott is the executive director for the Center for Arizona Policy. And Arizona is among the states that have passed a ban on so-called gender-affirming care for minors. But unlike the rest of the states, their law only prohibits trans surgeries on minors, but not puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. He's among those who have been working to champion a legislative effort called the Detransitioners Bill of Rights. It's a quest to advocate strategically for those who have been harmed. Though it was ultimately vetoed by the governor, Katie Hobbs, a Democrat, who called it unnecessary, I asked him to explain what the bill would have done and why he urged state legislators to support it and what happened.
What this is, it's a proactive and protective bill, and really makes no judgment as to whether transgenderism as an ideology or in practice is right or wrong. All it says is that people who have gone through surgical and chemical transition and have had the lifelong harms associated with those, when they make a decision later on in life and they realize that they've made a mistake, they still require care. They still need medical care, and they still need insurance coverage to take care of the medical issues that come with chemical and surgical interventions. So all this bill says is that they deserve equality of medical care and equality of insurance coverage, and that those medical institutions and those insurance companies that cover or that perform surgeries and provide chemical interventions, that they also have to provide the care that comes after that. That's really all this bill is. It's a simple bill that says that detransitioners do exist and they need care and coverage on an equal basis.
Interestingly, as the bill made its way through the legislative process, he encountered some fascinating political dynamics. The opposition did not send anyone to speak during the hearing in the upper chamber. He believes this was due to the emphasis they placed on certain merits of the bill.
What was interesting about the Detransitioner Bill of Rights, the dynamic that happened as it was going through the legislature, was this. When it was in that Senate Health and Human Services Committee, one Democrat, who's not really a moderate, voted in favor of this coming out of committee. Another one said, this sounds like common sense, but I don't know enough, so I'm going to vote now and reserve the right to vote. I'm going to vote no now, but reserve the right to vote yes on the floor. So it was really interesting. We were that close to getting a 6-1 vote out of the Senate committee with two left-wing Democrats being ayes. However, it got to the Senate and it got to the floor vote and it went along party lines and it was only Republicans voting for it, only Democrats voting against it. What was interesting when it got kicked over to the House was this. It goes into the House Health and Human Services Committee. The opposition sends nobody to testify against it. The liberals or left-wingers on the committee said very little during the hearing. We brought in doctors, we brought in parents, we had testimony from detransitioners, and very little was said by the opposition during this hearing. So what that says to me is a common sense of bill like this that just says equality of care and coverage. That's all we're asking. We're making no judgments as to whether transgender ideology is right or wrong, whether it's right or wrong for anybody to transition. All we're saying is that people who have undergone these medical procedures and have had these massive doses of foreign chemicals pumped into their body over a matter of months or years, they need medical care. And if you're a medical institution that does transition services, or if you are an insurance company that covers transition services, and every major insurance company does, you need to cover the care that the people who are having second thoughts about their transition need.
Among the organizations championing this initiative is a recently formed group called Do No Harm. In Season 1 of Generation Indoctrination, we spoke with January Littlejohn, a Florida mom whose young daughter was once caught up in gender confusion, but managed to desist. January's advocacy in the Sunshine State ultimately led to the passage of the Parents' Bill of Rights, and she's now speaking at conferences nationwide as a fellow of Do No Harm. I asked her how she got involved with advocating for detransitioners in other state legislatures.
And this ideology, it does not discriminate. It impacts families of all walks of life. And so I was brought on because I was already doing this informally in my free time. Every time I would speak out, I would get an influx of parents contacting me, thanking me for speaking out, wanting to know how to help their own child. Because, especially 3-4 years ago, there was such an element of shame and secrecy about this and fear for people simply telling the truth about what they were seeing and what they were experiencing. And so that is now what I do full time for Do No Harm. Is so anytime a parent contacts Do No Harm and they have a child that is struggling with this confusion, I help the parents get to the resources they need to walk their child through this confusion. And so, we're fighting this on multiple fronts through Do No Harm. We've got the parent advocacy through me and some other people working on that together. We've got detransitioner Chloe Cole, who obviously is a great advocate for detransitioners and even has, filed a lawsuit against Kaiser Permanente that is still pending. And then Do No Harm rolled out in 2023 the first detransitioner Bill of Rights. And this Bill of Rights is focused on informed consent, effective care, expanding insurance coverage to covering detransition interventions, legal restoration, and then justice for these individuals. So far we have Tennessee and Arizona who are running versions of our bill, and we are hoping that many more states will start to pick this bill up next session.
So, January, why do you think this is necessary? I know that there's an insurance issue. I've seen advocates speak about that, but unlike other mental health conditions, there are no billing codes for anything related to detransitioning. What's going on there?
Some of these things are just going to take time. I personally don't feel like health insurance should be covering these procedures in the first place, because you have situations where a female can't get medically necessary hormones for a variety of reasons. But if she were to say that she's transgender, all of a sudden she has access to testosterone and all kinds of hormones that her body does not medically need. And so you've got men able to access hormones in the name of transgender identity, but females can't access those that are medically necessary. I mean, there's so much wrong when it comes to the health insurance issue. But in my personal opinion, I don't believe that health insurance should be covering these elective procedures anyway. I don't believe that treating the physical body and sex trait modification interventions to treat the mental health issue of gender dysphoria should ever have been happening.
But it's more than just the medical damage, though. The psychological impact debilitates detransitioners, and good therapy can be hard to find. I spoke with Pamela Garfield Yeager, a licensed clinical social worker from California who now lives on the East Coast. Pamela is the author of A Practical Response to Gender Distress, Tips and Tools for Families, and she explained what she's routinely seen in her interactions with detransitioners.
It's interesting to even just watch people who I met like a year or two ago and where they are today, and many of them are in a much better place because they've learned to deprogram the things that they believed in. Even when they detrans, they hadn't fully gotten there. So to recognize that things are a lie, probably what is the biggest hurdle? I'd say the guilt, the self-loathing, I think, that they have to overcome. There's layers to that because there's the self-loathing they had to begin with to decide that they wanted to become a completely different person, to run away from whatever pain they had that led them to be trans, whatever vulnerability they had. And then there's the extra layers of now they've either done stuff to their bodies and then also just the pain that they have caused to people in their life, their family, their loved ones, their friends that they have left or abandoned, maybe temporarily, because a lot of them are able to repair those relationships, but there's usually some damage there. So working through repairing relationships and dealing with that guilt that you've run away from or abandoned your family that really did love you, that's a tough pill to swallow. So those are things to work through.
Pamela, what would you tell therapists who, like you, want to help this emerging group of people known as detransitioners?
There are, I guess, unique things around this topic because usually when someone makes bad decisions, the entire world and all our institutions aren't usually egging it on. So that's really hard to deal with where you're seeing someone who's done something that's harmful to them, but it's not really just them. It's all of the doctors and all the experts and all the people that they trusted, encourage them, maybe even coerce them to make these choices. So that's just a lot of things to acknowledge when you're in the session with somebody. I also believe that therapy isn't always the answer for people. So I really believe a lot in empowerment. I've been watching detransitioners who've quite frankly been burned by therapists who were ideologically captured. So it's hard for them to trust therapists. And in some circumstances, I worried about them because they weren't able to get that help. But then at the same time, I watched them find help other ways, and they're thriving now because they have found their way in all different ways. Some of them have found religion. Some of them have found new friends. Some of them have just gotten in touch with themselves and have let go of that anger that is so pervasive, because why wouldn't you be angry if everybody you trusted, they said that you're amazing and you're your true self and you're going to be amazing, that now says that they're throwing death threats at you? That's hard to manage. And I honestly can't even fathom that. But the point is that I think a good therapist just knows what to do because they're a good therapist.
And sometimes it's as simple as being a listening ear. When Steve Scare realized what was going on and he encountered these issues from within his own family, he decided to force the issue with the general public. He's now known as Sidewalk Steve, wearing sandwich boards with messages critical of gender ideology. Passers-by sometimes mock him in liberal New Hampshire towns. Others in the live free or die Granite State may personally oppose it, but their libertarian streak causes them to think it's not their business to interfere. But in an age when those who are critics of trans medicalization struggle to be published in mainstream media outlets, he's taken to the streets and has one-on-one conversations with anyone who will engage with him. I asked him to explain what he hears from detransitioners who see what he's doing.
One of the few perks of the job is I built a friendship with Prisha Mosley, a detransitioner who works really, really hard in spite of the trauma that she went through. And when I go out, even though she's not in my area at all, she thanks me for doing it, and she tells me how much that means to her. And it's funny that over the winter, there was one hearing that I was going to, because that's something else I try to do, is show up for the hearings. And I was there with Shannon McGinley, who works for Cornerstone Action in New Hampshire. And we were the only people supporting a bill to help make it easier for detransitioners to sue places like Dartmouth Hitchcock. And as we were going in, it was really funny that Shannon had a sick child at home. The weather was awful. It wasn't really safe driving there. And she said, well, we're doing this for the Prishas of the world, right? And it was really funny because I was already running my camera and I could share that with Prisha. When I first started out in the streets of Derry, there was someone who was obviously identifying as a transgender woman, got out of the car, and I'm by myself, and this is before I've got a security camera, so I thought, this could get ugly. And he gave me a big hug and said, I'm glad you're doing this. I didn't do this until I was well into adulthood. I see the kids getting into this, and they don't know what they're doing. And teenagers, too, who think they're going this way, and they start out, they want to tell me off. That's part of it. But they also want someone to hear their stories, which I listen to, and then I can ask probing questions like, okay, you're talking about taking testosterone, starting on this. When you're 16, do you know all the side effects? Yeah, well, yeah, I know some. They really want someone to listen to and share those concerns because they've got some doubts themselves, or they're not getting any pushback from people.
And sometimes that pushback, or even just questions, are the very thing these individuals need to help snap out of the rampant lies they've been told and the distorted truths they've been led to believe. I asked Steve what he has learned specifically while doing his street ministry.
No one told him about other options. No one really cared about everything they'd been through. So yeah, that's something that just being there to listen. I tell them, if a girl of 15 or 16 or a boy comes up to me, I've worked with teenagers all my life. You're never going to make a teenager to do something he or she doesn't want to do. You're not going to change their mind. So I make that really clear to them. I'll listen to you and I'll give you my opinion if you want it.
It's a frankness that many appreciate. But Steve simply sees it as part and parcel of doing his job. He cannot and will not be silent.
Sometimes people offer me money and I say, my friend Prisha Mosley, she can't work because she's in so much pain. She's dedicating all of this time and she's suffering traveling. It's really hard on her that she has a fund for her mission work. Also, the detransitioners are working with a very good law firm, Campbell Miller Payne. These guys are heroic. And in the meantime, they don't know if they're going to win these lawsuits. I sure hope so. If there's any justice in the world, of course they will. But in the meantime, they've got to meet ends, and it's cost money to help them out. So going to Prisha Mosley's, her fund, which is easy enough to find, Detrans Aqua, if you go on Twitter, it's individually asking what they need. I offered for Katie Anderson. I see her in church. I'm sitting a pew away from her. I try not to talk shop, but I asked her, what do you need help with? And she didn't need help with that. I think she'll have some educational expenses coming up. So it depends on what they need. Legislatively, to help detransitioners right now, the detransitioners you talked to probably told you there's no standards of care for them. There's no billing codes for them. Prisha pointed out that if you're bitten by an orca, Brandon, there is an insurance code for that. You're covered. They can get you that treatment. But for none of these things that detransitioners need, there's no insurance code at all. No standards of care. I know that Chloe Cole's been going and talking to people about that. The other issue that I've been working on and testifying before, too, is making sure that it's easy to hold the medical industry accountable the same way we held the medical industry accountable for opioids and tobacco companies for selling tobacco.
All of this brings me back to Ed Deal, the Republican legislator from Oregon. He, like many alert politicians, is at the forefront of this battle and has a keen ability to see the bigger picture. I asked him to explain where he thinks we are in the process, given that some are still denying that these things are happening. But what's his lens on the landscape?
What I see happening is the awareness is spreading. What started out as, I had a conversation with someone, I won't name who they were, their first, when I said, we're transitioning children. And he said, no, that's not happening. And then I said, well, I showed him evidence that it is happening. And he said, no, it's really rare. And then I showed him evidence that says it's not rare, it's happening all over. And then his response was, well, what do you care? What's it matter to you? I think as people, most people though, as they see that it is happening and that it is prevalent, they know it's wrong and they're willing to talk about it. And when they see some brave detransitioners that are willing to talk about it, I hope that when they see legislators like me and others talk about it, get out of our comfort zone, that they'll also be brave enough to speak up and say, no, this is wrong.
Indeed, crucial to helping detransitioners is pushing past the psychological discomfort one experiences that these medical procedures are being carried out on a daily basis. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, in the last few years, over 1,200 trans surgeries per year were being carried out in the United States on kids ages 18 and younger. If you divide 1,200 by 261, the number of annual business days, that's approximately 4.6 young people, many of them legal minors, being surgically maimed every single weekday. It's something that Greg Scott learned the hard way.
The first time I heard about kids being drugged in this way for the purpose of transition was probably 10 or 12 years ago. There is no way that the first time you hear about drugging and cutting kids in furtherance of a radical ideology, there's no time at which you find that out that is not completely disorienting. And it still is today. Check myself and say, this can't be happening, this can't be happening, this can't be happening. But it really is. And it will take a multi-front response to make sure that this stops happening to children, and the children who it's happened to already are cared for.
Next time on Generation Indoctrination, we'll explore what's being done to help parents and families, the often hidden victims of gender ideology, whose voices are usually silenced or ignored. Stay tuned.